Okay, hello, welcome to Adventures Among Ideas. Today I am talking about, or I'm going to try to talk about Morse Peckham's theory of value, and I'm going to try to apply this to the movie Joker, which is a hopefully good example that many people will have seen. So, in another video, I talked about Dewey's theory of value, and this is very or pretty different, not totally different, but it's different from what I'm going to talk about today. So Morse Peckham doesn't so much deal with value in terms of what we should do, what our priorities should be. He calls this values compared to value. So value and values. Values is what Dewey talks a lot about means and ends and choosing ends and means and so on, and what kinds of things we should do, should not do, and how we make those decisions. Peckham is more concerned with value, which is what other philosophers around, not philosophers, but other psychologists, not other psychologists, since Peckham wasn't a psychologist, but psychologists around that time in the second half of the 20th century would call self-esteem, or some related term like that, self-respect maybe. So when he talks about value, he's kind of this is kind of what other people will call self-esteem. I don't know if it exactly is the same, but it's pretty close. In another video, I'm hoping to talk about Ernest Becker's theory of self-esteem, which is kind of similar to what Peckham is talking about. Anyway, so talking about value. So this type of value is about whether we feel ourselves to be important. And this is something not dealt with a lot by philosophy for some reason. It's dealt with, I think, a little bit by Hegel. You can see this in the master-slave dialectic in Phenomenology of Spirit, and maybe in some other people, but it's not in some other philosophers, but I haven't noticed it being a big part of philosophy. Of course, more important to psychology. Maybe that's why philosophers don't talk about it that much. But it's worth talking about. Anyway, so value. Peckham calls this also, or Peckham so there's different words Peckham uses to talk about this, and I want to go through some of them. So the ascription of value he calls agape, or agape system. So agape is a Greek word for one of the Greek words for love, and Peckham uses this to talk about the ascription of value, the systems, the cultural systems that we have for ascribing value to each other are agape systems. And this is a kind of value semiosis. So Peckham was talking about this in the midst of his grand theory of behavioral semiotics, especially in his major work, Explanation and Power, his major theoretical work. And so this is where you get value coming in, and it's easier to understand if you understand Peckham's broader semiotic program and his theory of meaning. And his theory of value is a part of this theory of meaning as response, and value, making valuations, is one type of response we have to ourselves, to other people, to the things in our environment. So agape is the social system of ascribing value to each other. And he talks about public and private agape semiosis. So we ascribe value to others. There's public agape semiosis, and we ascribe value to ourselves privately in our thoughts, and this is private agape semiosis. Now, value, let's try to say a little bit more about something more concrete about what is value. Value seems to subsume, as far as I can tell, at least two more specific concepts, or more concrete concepts, and it may be boiled down to just one. So value may just be equivalent to one more specific concept. So it may relate to social role. I think we sometimes evaluate people simply because they fill a certain social role. and regardless of what else they actually do. So maybe just filling a certain role is can be a sign of value, can be a reason why we evaluate someone. So if someone is the president, you might say, and you can think of many exceptions to this, but if someone is the president, for example, of a country, we assign a certain value to them, even if we think they're not doing a good job necessarily. Or if someone is your child, even if they're deficient in various ways, you may still value them because they're your child. They fill a certain role, and by filling that role, they are we give them a certain value. But maybe the more important thing is competence, and this is where Peckham really focuses, is value as competence. When we say we value someone, if you actually drill down into what that actually means, it turns out that by and large, we're talking about competence. We think they're competent at certain things. So just to give an example that Peckham gives, if we say someone is a good person, well, what does that actually mean when you ask, well, why is this person a good person? Well, it turns out basically it's about competence. We think they're maybe a good parent, a good employee, a good friend, a good provider for their family, a good member of the community, a good athlete, or a kind person, kindness being a kind of competence in how you interact with other people, and so on and so on. So when we talk about someone being good or bad, it seems that we're just talking about competence. And maybe there's something else there, like I said, social role, but I'm not totally sure about that. It's hard to think of things that are about value that are not also about competence when we're talking about the value of a person. So what is valuing? Peckham says this is a judgment or determination that a behavior or the consequence or deposit of a behavior, so basically a behavior or the result of a behavior, is a competent fulfillment or enactment of a cultural instruction or set of cultural instructions. Peckham sees culture basically as a set of instructions. This is what culture is. When we are acting socially, we're following cultural instructions. Culture is a set of instructions maintained through social interaction. Social interactions are the flip side of culture. When we follow cultural instructions, we create society. Basically, is a simple way to look at it. So when we make a judgment of value about someone, about a behavior, we're judging whether it is a competent following of cultural instructions, basically whether it's socially appropriate. So Peckham goes on to say why we ascribe value. So why do we ascribe value to behaviors, to people? Well, human societies depend on culture to exist, and the continuation of that existence, of the existence of cultures, or the existence of human societies, depends on our valuing the consequences of that culture, the culture that comes out of those societies. So again, human societies depend on culture, and the continuation of societies depend on valuing the culture. So we depend on culture because there's various features of the human organism, the human brain, that lead us to depend so much on culture, right? We're less determined by our biology, by our genetics, although of course we're still to some extent determined by those, but a lot of our everyday behaviors are determined more by culture, by learning. Peckham, randomness. The randomness of the brain is a big theme for Peckham, and we need culture to guide the human brain in a certain direction, because otherwise our behavior will be too chaotic, determined more by the randomness of the brain. Yeah, so we need culture to guide our behavior so that we can live together, and therefore we judge each other in our competency at being guided by culture. So when we value someone as good, we see them as being appropriately guided by their culture. And when we think they are bad, we think they are not appropriately guided by cultural instructions. Say they're being asocial or antisocial or something like that. And there's a couple of ways to control or guide or manage behavior, whichever way you want to think about it. So basically, verbal and nonverbal. There's verbal and nonverbal ways to guide behavior, and then there's some different ways within those two broader categories. So let me just mention nonverbal and verbal, mention both of them as we go along. So nonverbal are things like force or sanctions. These would be like if we think someone is bad, if we evaluate what they do as a negative, as a bad thing, we apply force or sanctions to them. And the opposite of that, the flip side of that, is reward. If someone does what we think is good, we reward them. If they do something that we think is valuable, we reward them. And verbal is kind of the same, but verbal behavior is not force per se, but it's rhetoric. Peckham talks about the rhetoric of threat or denigration. So again, if someone does something bad, we threaten them with force, with nonverbal force. We denigrate them. So we say, you're bad, you're worthless. No one should love you. No one should pay attention to you. And the flip side of that is flattery or seduction. So the rhetoric of flattery and seduction. So we say, you're worthy, you're great. So to go back to the nonverbal quickly, nonverbal force. So there's force that could be things like deprivation of freedom or resources, torture, execution. Right? At the limit, execution is the most you can do to someone. Or at least the kind of the last step in the ascending order of severity of application of force. And then reward. Of course, you can reward someone, you can give them more resources, more freedoms, you can give them signs of value like medals and fancy titles and things like that. And then rhetoric, verbal management of behavior. So again, threat, denigration, flattery. So denigration, things like you're worthless, meaning basically that you're incompetent. You're incompetent in your behavior. Flattery. So actually, Peckham considers denigration to be the primary rhetoric of behavioral control, and he considers force to be the primary nonverbal way of behavioral control. Like these are our primary tools, and then the flip sides of those, like flattery and reward, are kind of secondary. They're the negation of the primary method of control. So it's kind of a tragic or unsettling view of how society works. So flattery or seduction is the negation of denigration, which denigration is the primary verbal means of behavioral control. So you're worthy, you're good, basically means you're competent. Love, I would say, is the ultimate flattery in our culture. It's a complicated concept. I'm not going to try to break it down. I think it's actually a mix of different things, which are not all about value. But yeah, it's the basic. Basically, I would say it's the ultimate rhetorical flattery in our culture is to apply the word love to someone. I love you, or I love what you did, or something like that. All right. Anyway, the reason that these rhetorics, that the rhetorics of denigration and flattery work, is because agape is unstable. The system of applying value and people's valuations of themselves, all of that is unstable. It's quite difficult for us to know whether we're competent or incompetent social actors. How do you know whether what you did was actually right or not, whether it was appropriate or not? And that's always kind of changing. We're constantly looking to others to help us stabilize our value. We're always put in different complicated situations where it's not clear what we're supposed to do. So we rely a lot on others telling us, that was a good thing to do. You shouldn't have done that. This is why, by the way, I think social media is so powerful. So when our posts get liked, when our tweets get retweeted, these are ascriptions of value. These are ascriptions to us of competence. They make us feel competent, right? I am smart, I'm intelligent, I'm beautiful, whatever the case is. I'm talented. So on the other hand, if our posts get bad comments or get ignored even, these are judgments of incompetence. Like, you're not worth paying attention to. You should not have done it like this. This was a stupid thing to do. Why do you look like this? So it's withholding value from us. It's taking away value. It's right, judging that we're incompetent as people. And so, yeah, social media can be very powerful in a positive way, a negative way, in a good way, and a bad way. Pets also, it's worth mentioning, are an important source of value for many people. Pets have been selected basically to ascribe value to us, to flatter us. So pets are flattering generally, especially dogs. And there's probably some important difference between cat people and dog people in terms of what kinds of things stabilize their sense of value. I don't know a whole lot about human-pet relations from a theoretical or psychological standpoint, so I'm not going to try to go into detail. But it's interesting to think about, what do pets do for us? Clearly, they are ascribing value, helping us to ascribe value to ourselves. Right, when our pets are always kind of happy to see us, that is a big value boost. Another important source of value are things like clubs and churches. And kind of like pets, it's something that is a constant source of value. So you're ascribed value simply by belonging to a particular club or a particular church, generally speaking. And in clubs and churches, you're instructed in how to ascribe value to yourself and to others. It's kind of maybe a rehearsal for other types of situation, and helps you figure out how to ascribe value in a a situation where there's not as much at stake, where your economic livelihood, for example, is not at stake, your survival is not at stake. It's a safer environment. Yeah, so the verbal behavior Peckham points out that the verbal behavior in a club or a church is an explanatory regress, and this is one of Peckham's big concepts, is explanatory regresses that stabilize the meaning of something that happens, of a sentence, of a word, is explanatory regress, where more general statements subsume more concrete statements. Anyway, the institution is explained. Institutions like clubs or churches are explained in such a way that stabilizes value. So, for example, a church or a club might be said to be better than other clubs or churches in some respect, or to be uniquely good at whatever they're doing. Right? If you're in some kind of sports club, you want to be seen as maybe better than other sports clubs, or at least have your own kind of unique qualities that make you different and in some respect better than other clubs. So you explain yourself in a certain way. Your club maybe has a certain history, or your church has a certain history, and maybe certain important people belong to it at one time or another. And these are ways of stabilizing the value of the institution, or the people in the who are part of the institution, the club or the church. Another important aspect, which I'm forgetting now if Peckham specifically talks about. Oh, he does talk about this, yeah. So people tend to move toward how other people evaluate them. They tend to, not 100% of the time, but people tend to move in the direction of their social valuation. So if you denigrate someone, if you constantly supply them with a negative sense of value, showing that they're incompetent all the time, they will tend to become more and more incompetent. This is not always true. Some people will negate that. So negation is an important part of human behavior that should not be overlooked. So sometimes if someone is constantly denigrating us, we'll negate that and say, oh yeah, well, I'm going to show you. And then that's one important driver of human behavior as well. But uh, people who for over a long period of time are um, kind of surrounded or bombarded with denigration will tend to internalize that, we might say. It becomes just a part of their behavior. They become incompetent. Likewise, if you flatter someone, they will tend to flatter themselves. We might say they get a big head. Flattery can increase someone's competency. This is one thing that psychologists have tried to study, where flattering someone will help them improve because it makes them feel good. Like even if they did something imperfectly, you flatter them and that keeps them interested in whatever they're trying to improve themselves on, whatever they're trying to learn. So it can be better to flatter someone who's trying to learn something than to denigrate them, because then they won't want to keep learning. On the other hand, some people will rebel against flattery and negate the flattery. And so Peckham notes that an important part of being a manager is knowing how your employees respond to flattery and denigration. So some employees you need to flatter a lot. Some employees you need to denigrate more, because there's personality differences. So anyways, I'm going to talk a little bit about Joker. Probably been talking too long already, but yeah. So Joker, Peckham also talks about valuing as a whirlwind. We live in a chaotic whirlwind of valuing, he says. A whirlwind that shapes and distorts all of us, that damages most of us, and that destroys some of us. And some of the most interesting cultural products, I think, like books and movies and TV shows probably, are things that focus or draw us into this whirlwind of valuing as spectators. So we're able to kind of take it in from a more distanced position. We're not involved in it personally. Whereas in our lives, we're in the middle all the time, basically, of this whirlwind of valuing that is constantly coming at us from all sides in good ways and bad ways, and in a way that can be totally confusing. And I think a lot of interesting books and movies and things like that, artworks, are about this, and especially about the negative aspects of it, especially about the effects of denigration. And one other one that I like that I'll mention, just quickly mention, is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. This is a book that's largely about value semiosis, about agape and its effects. And but a more recent one that people will know better is Joker, a recent movie. It's from 2019, about the origin of the Batman villain. So this is about Joker is about Arthur Fleck, who becomes Joker, and Arthur Fleck is constantly, when you watch the movie, he's just constantly being denigrated in verbal and non-verbal ways. He's constantly being told that he's worthless, or showed that he's worthless, and there's some interesting moments where he rebels against that, or negates those denigrations. But you see him, for example, getting harassed and beaten up by kids. Again, this is a kind of nonverbal denigration and applications of force. So you see him getting reprimanded by his boss. He's told that people think he's weird, that he's a freak. Again, this is a verbal denigration. Yeah, the mother on the bus, he's trying to relate to this kid on the bus. One time, the mother tells him to stop bothering her son. You see him do all kinds of incompetent things throughout the movie. One of the biggest is he's at the children's hospital and he drops a gun onto the floor. Because of that, his boss fires him. So that's an economic sanction, right? So a negative valuation of his competence, applying that's one of the major sanctions, is economic deprivation, being fired from your job. Yeah, you see him being insulted various times, even his mother. At one point, he's trying to be a comedian, and his mother says, "Don't you have to be funny to be a comedian?" So he's attacked also on the subway again. So attacked by kids at the beginning. Later on, he's attacked by young men, but grown men on the subway. He mentions, again, this so verbal and nonverbal denigration on the subway. So he mentions at one point that he has all he has are negative thoughts. Do you have any, he's asked something like, do you have any negative thoughts? He's like, all I have are negative thoughts. So there's a private, right? Private denigration. So you've got the public side and the private side. Public agape semiosis, private agape semiosis. So he's having all these negative thoughts. He thinks about killing himself. Again, that's another kind of private agape semiosis, a private denigration. He tries to kill himself at one point, I think, by getting into the refrigerator. And so that would be the ultimate judgment of personal incompetence, I guess, or personal worthlessness. And it gets made fun of on the Murray Franklin show. All kinds of other things happen that in our culture are signs of bad value, of denigration, like finding out that your mother is delusional. His mother is very unstable. He thinks for a minute that Thomas Wayne is his father. He finds out that he doesn't really have a father, that he was abandoned, and then adopted, and then abused, and all of these things are negatives, right? Negative signs of value in our culture. But he also hallucinates or imagines his own signs of value. So while he's being bombarded by all these negative signs of value, at least some of the time, he hallucinates or imagines his own signs of value. So there's a scene where he imagines being flattered by the late night comedian Murray Franklin. He imagines he's watching in the audience and Franklin singles him out and kind of basically provides value to him. Says, "I wish I had a son like you," or something like that. So that's obviously, when someone says that, it's obviously an obvious kind of flattery or ascription of value to you. He has the whole delusion or hallucination of having a girlfriend, a woman who lives in the same building as him, which of course would be another ascription of value, having a girlfriend if you're a guy. Yeah, there's the interesting part about killing the men who attack him on the subway. This is, here we get into the whirlwind of value even more, I think. This is an act that is reinforced by the lower classes. It's, a sign of the reaction of the lower classes is a sign of value, right? They think it was a good thing. And so a kind of flattery that he gets from, even though people don't know that he's the one who did it at first, the way that the lower classes react is a kind of flattery to him. But then the upper classes, of course, have the opposite reaction. So they are sort of denigrating him because of this, or denigrating the act showing that it was an incompetent, socially incompetent act. So you have these two different conflicting messages coming about his execution of the men on the subway. Um, yeah, so the lower classes, the way the lower classes in Gotham relate to him is, or how they imagine him, since they don't know it's him, but what they imagine to have happened is a big verbal and nonverbal verbal valuation. So people praise him or praise his actions, and people copy him, right? They start dressing like him. They start dressing like clowns. And yeah, so there's all these all these this whirlwind of positive and negative valuation coming at him throughout the whole movie, and you can kind of understand why people would be unstable in those kind of circumstances. And it gives you a little bit of a insight into how much of our life is determined by the valuations that come at us from other people, and then the valuations that we're making of ourselves all the time. I'll hopefully talk about this maybe next week with Ernest Becker, who talks about I think the inner newsreel we have of basically valuation of ourselves. He talks about it using the concept of self-esteem, but we're constantly playing over in our heads what's good about us, what's bad about us, what we did good, what we did that's bad. And yeah, so that's about valuation. And for today, about Peckham's theory of valuation, which I'm trying to write about. And so I'll talk about some other theories of value in the coming weeks, probably. But yeah, that's all for today. That's where I'll end it for today. So thank you for listening, and have a good day.